Today we'll continue our discussion about the history of the Orthodox Church, and we'll start talking about what happened in the life of the Orthodox Church in the second millennium of her existence. But before we go into that, I want to tell you a little bit about a last big debate between the Eastern and the Western that, interestingly enough, happened between two Greek theologians, between Gregory Palamas and Barlaam of Calabria in the 1300s. St. Gregory Palamas was a monk who became a bishop, the Bishop of Thessalonica, and he lived in Greece, and he was very accustomed with hesychasm and the spiritual life of Mount Athos. And on the other hand, Barlaam of Calabria was of Greek descent, but he grew up in Calabria in one corner of Italy today, but he was Greek, but living in this Greek colony. And he was Orthodox, he was Greek Orthodox, but he became a theologian of the Orthodox Church. But the fact that he grew up in the West, he already had some Western influences in his way of thinking. And when St. Gregory Palamas tried to defend the prayer of the heart and the theology of hesychasm of the monks of Mount Athos, Barlaam of Calabria was the theologian himself at the court of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople, stood up against St. Gregory the theologian, and he claimed that the grace of God is created, and that light that was seen by Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration when the Lord was transfigured was not uncreated light, but created light. And he also claimed that grace is created and given to the church, and the church gives the grace to the world. And the best way to know God is not through prayer, but through the mind, through philosophy and knowledge. Basically by reading books about God. On the other hand, St. Gregory Palamas defended the teaching of the early church that the grace of God is uncreated. It comes out of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It belongs to God, but is not God. And this uncreated grace of God comes from God and comes upon the world, comes upon the created world, and through it, God guides the world. And the best way to know God is through a personal encounter with Him through prayer. That's why prayer of the heart, standing still and knowing that He is God, as Psalm 46 says, open to the grace of God as the prophets of the Old Testament did. Where are you? Here I am. Having a personal relationship with God is the best way to know God. Reading, theologizing about God takes us only so far. We need it. But ultimately, it is a personal relationship that God is calling us to. And the best way to get into this intimate personal relationship with God is through prayer, through the heart, through the very core of our being, in the Spirit, because God is Spirit, and He put His Spirit in us, and that's the best way to connect with God. The teaching of St. Gregory Palamas was approved by 3 councils in the 1300s. Barlaam of Calabria eventually had to leave Constantinople. He went back to the West. He joined the Latin Church, and he became a bishop in the Latin Church. But it was interesting to see, because even if, as I said, even if he was initially, and he was raised in the Orthodox faith, he already gained this Western way of thinking, which influenced his theology, and this was like a last debate between the Eastern theologians and the Western-minded theologians. Of course, this theology about the uncreated grace of God has huge implications in the life of the world. Because if we that the grace of God, through which God guides the world, is created, doesn't really belong to God, but is created by God, and it belongs to creation, not really to God, then God is not present in his creation. First of all, this goes against the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, which proves us clearly that the transcendent God could become part of matter, could become immanent, Emmanuel. Also, it is a dangerous separation of God from his creation. And as many theologians would point out, it is based on this theology of the Western Church, of the separation of God from creation, and the fact that grace is created and given to the church that gives it to the world. It is not by accident that the abuse of creation of God started in a more obvious way in Western Europe. Because if we know that that the uncreated grace of God is present everywhere and guides everything, then we would have a lot more respect for the creation of God. The Orthodox Church is not pantheistic, because this doesn't mean that God in his nature is present in everything. That would be pantheism. But the Orthodox Church is not theist. God is in heaven, we are here, we are separated. We do what we want, and he's in heaven. No. The Orthodox Church is panentheist, which means that God, in his grace, not in his nature, is everywhere present and filling all things. So this was, as I said, a last big debate between the Western-minded theologians and the Eastern-minded theologians. And now we are going to talk about the spread of the Orthodox Church. And this already happened, already started to happen at a big scale in the 800s. The Slavs came from Asia, and they settled in Central Europe and also in the Balkans, all the way to the northern border of the Byzantine Empire. One of these Slavic groups settled in Central Europe, in Moravia, and their prince was Radislav. And of course, Radislav, now being surrounded by Christians, he wanted to learn about Christianity, and he realized that this is a different kind of faith. He wanted to adopt Christianity, but he had a problem. The Western missionaries coming from Rome and from the Germans were using Latin, trying to convert the Slavs to Christianity using Latin. The Slavs couldn't understand Latin. So he sent word out, I want some Christian missionaries that would be able to preach the gospel in the language of my people. He also sent word to Constantinople. And it happened that the bishop of Constantinople at that time was a very enlightened man, St. Photius, who remembered, in fact, who knew very well, because he was still very much in touch with these two brothers, Cyril and Methodius. And so Cyril and Methodius used to be the disciples of St. Photius. He was their teacher. And Photius knew that Cyril and Methodius knew Slavonic. Why? Because, as you can see in this map, Cyril and Methodius lived in Thessalonica. So Thessalonica is here, and as you can see, the border of the Byzantine Empire with the Slavs to the north. So Thessalonica was very close to the border with the Slavs to the north. And of course, there were some Slavs in Thessalonica. And Cyril and Methodius picked up Slavonic from the other children, from the Slavs, playing together in Thessalonica. So, a long story short, Photius called Cyril and Methodius, and he asked them if they would be willing to become missionaries to the Slavs, because they knew Slavonic. They agreed, and they went to Moravia. But before they went to Moravia, very lovingly, Cyril and Methodius designed the so-called Cyrillic alphabet, Cyrillic or Slavonic alphabet. Starting from the Greek alphabet, they designed an alphabet for the Slavs because they didn't have a written language at the time. Not only that, they translated the Bible and the service books into Slavonic, and then they went to Moravia. Now, in Moravia, they clashed with the Latin missionaries who were insisting on Latin. They went to Rome to appeal to the Bishop of Rome. It was in the 1800s that the church was one. So they went to Rome to appeal to the Bishop of Rome. The Latin missionaries insisted that there are only 3 holy languages that should be used in the church: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And why this? Because Pontius Pilate wrote the sentence of the Lord that was nailed to the cross above the head of the Lord in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek. Now, that was Pontius Pilate. Okay? Pontius Pilate should not decide that these are holy languages, and that was not his intention. It was, these were the spoken languages in the area at the time. Cyril and Methodius said, no, on the day of Pentecost, when the apostles spoke, everybody understood their message in their language. That's what we should do. The Pope agreed with Cyril and Methodius, but still one of them died in Rome of natural causes. The other one went back to Moravia, but still the Latin missionaries made his life miserable, and he died in Moravia. Their mission in Moravia was not very successful. Nevertheless, they translated the Bible and the service books into Slavonic. When their disciples had to leave Moravia, they went where? To Bulgaria. Now the Greeks have been trying to convert the Bulgarians. These were the Slavs just north of Greece. The Greeks have been trying to convert the Bulgarians to Christianity using Greek, not making very much progress. When the disciples of Cyril and Methodius came from Moravia to Bulgaria, in less than 100 years, the Bulgarians embraced Orthodox Christianity, and they even had their own patriarchate in less than 100 years. So you never know when your work is going to show the results. Sometimes it is after you die. Also, a big result of the work of St. Cyril and Methodius is the fact that all you can see on this map of the world in dark green or light green, so all these areas are using the Slavonic alphabet in the world today. So the disciples of Cyril and Methodius went to Bulgaria. They converted the Bulgarians to Orthodox Christianity. And another very important conversion of the Slavs of the north this time, happened in 988, when the so-called Rus people, these were the Russians, today's Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. They were one nation at that time in the late 900s, and their leader was Prince Vladimir. Same thing, Prince Vladimir realized that there is something special about Christianity, and he decided to embrace Christianity in its Eastern form and expression. So he was baptized himself, his mother, Olga, was baptized, and then the entire nation of Rus, of the Slavs of the north, was converted to Christianity in 988. So as you can see, we already have the Bulgarians and then the Slavs of the north. So the Serbians and the Romanians in the Balkans, being in between the Slavs of the south and the Slavs of the north, they were converted themselves. The Serbs also are Slavic. They belong to the Slavs of the south. They embrace Christianity. We had some seeds of Christianity in Serbia from the time of the early church. But we can see the church being organized very well since about the 7 and the 800s. Same thing in Romania. Early Christian seeds since the time of the Roman Empire, but now with the Slavs north of them and south of them embracing Orthodox Christianity, the Romanians are being converted to Orthodox Christianity, and the church is very well organized from about the year 1000 to 1200. Georgia is another country that embraced the Orthodox Christianity from the time of the early church, from the 4th century. And until today, the majority of the people in Georgia are Orthodox Christians. Now, in 1453, a big tragedy happened in the life of the Byzantine Empire. Basically, that was the end of the Byzantine Empire, when at the end of May 1453, finally the city of Constantinople fell under the Turks. Why I say finally? Because little by little, the Ottoman Empire conquered everything. Southeast, northwest of Constantinople, as you can see in this map, only what is in purple was left of the Byzantine Empire. As you can see, the Ottoman Empire was northwest, southeast of Constantinople, and in 1453, the city of Constantinople itself finally fell under the Turks. This was a great tragedy. But on the other hand, it was a blessing, because we couldn't have theological schools anymore. That was a blessing and a tragedy also. We'll talk about that next time. So the Turks allowed the Christians to exist in the territory conquered by them because they wanted them to pay higher taxes. But the Christians were not allowed to have any theological schools. They were not allowed to have any organized charitable work. And by penalty of death, they were not allowed to do any missionary work. However, how got worse in mysterious ways. As we could see, in the late 900s, the Russians were converted to Orthodox Christianity. And they were converts. They wanted to spread the word. That's what converts do. They wanted to share with other people what they found. And they had a very interesting way of doing missionary work. It was not a very loud missionary work. Basically what happened, monks from what was the land inhabited by the Russians went further east into the forests to pray and to find seclusion. They couldn't go into the desert because no deserts in Russia, but they had the forests. So if they wanted to be hermits and to find seclusion and just to pray and to be closer to God, some hermits would leave the monasteries and go further east into the wilderness, into the forests. Now there were some native people in those forests. And they noticed that there was something special about this man who's praying by himself in the forest. And then they wanted to become like him. And the monastery was formed around him. And then the next generation wanted some people who wanted to go into seclusion, into the forest, to pray and to be closer to God. And they had to go further east. And basically, that's how Russia grew to be the biggest country in the world. The administration followed these hermits and their missionary work. By the 1700s, by the 1800s, they became also better organized. They even had an entire academy for translating the Bible and the service books into the languages of the native people of Eastern Asia and Siberia. And they did a great missionary work all the way to Alaska, where they arrived in the late 1700s. And that's how Alaska, by the way, became a Russian territory, because of the Russian fur traders, and then the monks went to Alaska and did missionary work, and then the administration followed them. So this is very briefly part of the history of the Orthodox Church in the second millennium. God willing, next time we will finish our discussion about the history of the Orthodox Church in this